Thank you very much, Victor. If we go to the next slide, it's a pleasure to introduce to you where we see how we see the current regulatory framework as industry. We've mentioned already, and I speed up in terms of in order to have some time for the Q&A later on. We've seen already that we have a certain flexibility, and also I would even speak about scientific excellence in EMA, which has attracted a lot of products from the regulatory level. We should make sure that we're not taking that at risk in what we're doing with the BTC legislation. We've heard about that very often. Blood tissues and cells are the starting material for ATMPs. So this revision of legislation concerns ATMPs quite a lot. So we have to make sure that we're maintaining that scientific excellence and competitiveness and flexibility in ATMPs, as it has been shown by Simone and Martina. I mentioned already before, and the MEP so-called also hinted to the incentives. It's really critical that we are keeping our incentive system, both for orphan drugs, but also at the level of regulatory data protection, competitive as well. If we're including instruments like unmet medical need, which are very broad concepts, which can only be filled with life at the level of an individual patient, we're putting innovation at risk. We're putting at risk that we're getting these products, because if companies and investors don't know how much time they have to recoup their investment, there is an issue. And introducing concepts like unmet medical need, again, a very broad concept where we probably have very different ideas if we put 10 people in one room, whether there's an unmet medical need. It depends on the individual patient. So that is something which we hope we can avoid. We need to have clear and predictable incentives as we have them today in our European system. That's also part of the reason why we see innovation coming quickly to Europe, next to the excellent work of the European Medicines Agencies. And we've heard also from Martina that we need to work and fine-tune better on the clinical trial environment. So we have a new clinical trial regulation in place, which needs to prove that it's a future-proof also in practice now that we have the database on up and running. But it looks like we have to do more when it comes to ATMPs. So these is my plea on at this current regulatory level. I would want to very quickly move on to something on the next slide, which has been mentioned before. We need to put patients at the center of the whole process, and the whole process of bringing access to patients of ATMPs is not only about the regulatory level, it's also about post-launch evidence generation, and it's also about overcoming hurdles at the pricing and reimbursement level. And we've heard, I think, from both speakers before that real-world evidence, post-launch evidence generation is also critical to convince payers and HTAs to actually accept some data gaps in areas where there's a lot of unknown, where there's few knowledge about the therapy, that we accept those tools like real-world evidence into the mix of our decision-making processes, not just at the regulatory level, but also at the level of pricing and reimbursement. So real-world evidence is really a tool which we need to explore further. We've seen it developed in the area of ATMPs. We've seen it used successfully in that space, and we can even go beyond that to take real-world evidence into decision-making processes at the reimbursement level. If we go to the next slide, that talks about another tool which I think is very relevant. Next slide, on innovative payment models, which is another tool which we can employ to convince payers and HTA bodies to make sure that there's adequate and conditional reimbursement. We've seen models proposed by companies that there are repayment obligation or payback obligations or certain guarantees of success for individual patients. I think that is something which needs to be further explored in the pharmaceutical strategy, because we've seen that especially in ATMPs. It's not a regulatory issue, but I wanted to bring it up here because it's part of the solution which we are seeing to really make sure that we have better access to patients in innovative therapies. If I can give a guarantee to a payer in a rare disease patient population that there is success, it is more likely that payers would actually say yes and reimburse those patients if they get actually a payment back if the patient is a non-responder. If we move on to the next slide, and I'm looking at time, to allow us some time for the Q&A. The last point, or the one other point I wanted to make is on the hospital exemption. Is really important that we're having the hospital exemption, because in many areas we do not see a clinical development in the pharmaceutical companies, and we need to solve those needs. We need to make sure that also those patients where there is no clinical trial ongoing have access to innovation, but this is an access on the basis of a non-routine practice, and this is something which we probably have to define better, and we need to make sure that we are limiting the scope of the hospital exemptions in area where there is no authorized therapy on the table. If we have an authorized therapy authorized by the EU on the basis of a CUT and CHMP assessment, we should give priority to those treatments, and we should also give priority to clinical trials ongoing in ATMPs, because otherwise we might not see patients included in those clinical trials, and we see a further decrease in clinical trials. So anything which is more regulated, like a clinical trial, or an authorized centrally approved ATMP, should get priority over the hospital exemption in the given label. But there is a lot of space for the hospital exemption to be used outside of that label. If we go to the next slide, and that's my final slide, ATMPs are at the forefront also when it comes to health technology assessment. And I think it has been mentioned that the access hurdles are very much at the national level when it comes to pricing and reimbursement decisions for those complex one-time therapies. We've also heard that the regulatory framework seems to be more or less fit for purpose, apart from the fact that clinical trials are decreasing. But we need to make sure that we have the right methodology in place for ATMPs for one-time treatments, because it's not in such a far distance that we will assess ATMPs first in the EU HTA at the EU level. And we need to make sure that we have the right methodology in place to assess those one-time therapies. I stop here, Victor, just a short snapshot on the points we wanted to make from the industry perspective. Thank you very much.